All right. Thank you all for coming here. I think we should just get started. So welcome, everyone, to the launch for the Feminist Futures of Work with Amsterdam University Press. I'm trying to look at where there's the editor, Maurice. So, all right. So basically, what good fortune, because today is also International Women's Day, so happy Women's Day, right? So yay. All right. Hey, come on. Like a little more. Wow. Whew. Okay, that at least now sets a bar. Okay. So, so I'm Payal Arora. I'm one of the editors, along with Usha Raman and René, who's right out there, René König. And so basically, what's nice is that I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces and new faces. And also, I'm really happy to see that people have joined us online. Even though actually I can't see it. I was about to say, oh, there it is. But I know there's a good group who's joined us online, so that's fun. So I just want to flag that this panel is a follow-up from a symposium we had last year in April with a lot of the authors from this book. And that was actually called The Inclusive Work and the Platform Economy. So there we brought a number of the authors who come from very different sectors, engaged in different areas and how it's getting disruptive with the new technologies and, what is the place and how is these areas of work reconfiguring. So today, though, we're going to stay closer to the bone, right? Closer to the worker and particularly the marginalized, precarious worker, and what does that mean in terms of opportunities as well as risks. And we have some wonderful speakers here to really give weight to that. Now, the good news is you can download the book for free, and that has been made possible with this open access thanks to our funder, IDRC, which is a Canadian grant organization. They've also been very generous in their funding, and they've funded Usha and I for a 3-year grant project, and we also built something which is called FemLab, which is a Feminist Future of Work initiative, and a little more on that a little later. First thing, back to the book, right? So when you go through the book, which, as you'll see on the socials, you can click on it and it's free already to access and read. We still have some tweaks, and it'll be the full copy by end of the month and the printed version in a few months. But what you'll see is a variety of different public and private stakeholders who have contributed to it, like Harambee Youth in South Africa, to Adobe, to UNHCR, Ola Mobility Institute, Zeneca Inclusive Fashion. I mean, the list goes on. And that was very exciting for us. I mean, especially as academics who are really trying to get out of that crazy academic space where you're speaking to only each other, and then you're actually engaging with people across a different spectrum. So as you read these essays, I hope it'll inspire you and give you as much insight as we got. And because it really tells stories from different perspectives, especially on the precarity and, with a focus on women workers. Now, the book is definitely a product of the pandemic, and I think there's something to be said about that. I mean, it's basically in late 2019, Usha and I won this grant from IDRC, and our goal was basically to look at how low-income women workers, precarious and informal sectors, engaging with new technologies, platforms, infrastructures, and to what degree is this opening up opportunities as well as, posing a number of new risks. And we had this team in place and all ready to get go, and, it was in Jan 2020, and then the pandemic hit. So in this lockdown, it was extremely constraining for our researchers because they were unable to build that essential relationships with the workers, particularly in these very isolated, marginalized, and vulnerable areas. So Usha, myself, and René kind of brainstormed, like, how do we, capitalize on this time that we have. And so we set up something like a blog series and invited artists, activists, thinkers, programmers, just people who are willing to contribute. And one thing for sure is we told them, please don't write like this, sort of as if it's from a website, right? Speak from the heart, put yourself at the center. Like, if you're working as a programmer at a company, but what does that actually mean? Like, how does that compute in and especially with this possibly one of the biggest social experiments of our time, right, during the lockdown. So these are very visceral essays that you will hear from people from very different disciplines. And it was a challenge to get everyone streamlined into a sort of like de-jargonized narrative so we can start to communicate with one another. And I think that's what's, I would say, the strength of this book. And that really inspired us from these blogs. And Usha, René, and I thought, okay, we got to push this into a book and make it open access so very different people can read it. So over the last 3 years, we formed this really nice, collective and of researchers, creatives, and activists from all over the world, and also wonderful affiliates and partners. Many of them are in the room here, as well as online. Maybe you can make some noise. FemLabbers and partners. Okay. There's quite a few. Actually, what's good is a number of us had not actually seen each other. Like some of them, I was like, no, I've been looking at this woman for 2 years or something, a number of you. And now it's physically. And I'm like, no, we surely have met, right? So that's the beauty. I think this is something which is the silver lining about it, right? Is that FemLab culture was entirely almost shaped online in the first 2 years. And that is a testament to the opportunities that the digital can afford, but also the idea that a collective can be formed in these kinds of disparate and remote settings. So, all right, with that aside, let me get to the panel, which is where, the meat of the conversation is we have a fantastic panel, and Usha is going to be moderating it and giving brief introductions, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. But just a few quick acknowledgements here. There's, in case you're wondering what's all that, this is Siddhi Gupta, and she's a designer and Renaissance woman, and I told her, practically, proposed to her for, she's my future wife. Oh, I shouldn't get gendered here. So, okay, I take it back. Anyway, but also she's... Okay, that's right. I already asked her parents in Delhi last week. Anyway, and she's part of Justice Adda, a co-partner of ours, and the founder's right here, Siddharth. I don't know where he is. Yes, there he is. It's a design and law nonprofit, fabulous work. Please check them out. And so she'll be doing this sort of digital storytelling. Oh, she came up with a word, script something. And so just go with it, right? Okay. And Moy, Zotran, and Shruti are going to be handling the socials. I don't know where you guys are. Yes, there they are. So please retweet, reshare, and amplify the conversation. And there's Shruti, again, I'll bring her again. She's, like I was saying, she's the air we breathe because she's been in so many different aspects of our project, and René has been a leader in organizing our event, and a big thank you to that. So I think last but not least, Amsterdam Press, thank you so much for making this happen, and SPOWY 25, appreciate. I don't know where the team is again, so but thank you. So all right, with that, thank you for also the people who are online. I saw there's a long list of registrations, so this is exciting. I know some of the FemLabbers are on there. There's actually also Linnea Thompson. I assume you're watching. She's a thesis student of mine, and a couple of years ago, she wrote her thesis on around the subject that inspired Usha and I to write the grant. So, and now she's in some sort of corporate thing. I don't know what. But anyway, thank you. And this is where inspiration comes, right? So, all right. And I now hand it over to Usha. Thanks.
So thank you, Payal, for setting the standard high and for introducing FemLab. And thank you all again for being here. Some of you have come from quite a distance, flown overseas and so on. And it's really gratifying because for the past 3 years, we've been doing this on screens. And as Payal said, many of us are meeting for the first time, but it doesn't seem like the first time because we've been talking constantly. So to get on to the panel, the 3 years of learning have really shown us that it's very difficult to box the questions we all have into a single discipline. So you find, of course, as Payal said, in the book, we have people from all sorts of spaces who have contributed. So in some sense, the panel that we're presenting today also is a really diverse panel. And what we're trying to understand is what does it mean to be part of the precariat? A term that now we've all come to become very familiar with, right? Questions like what new formations is digital capitalism taking? What do transnational market forces do to the person who's at the center of it all, which is the worker? And we particularly are interested in women workers who tend to be even more marginalized than, of the precariat, they end up being even more marginalized. So are there ways of understanding the role of the worker, the role of work, when work itself is so poorly understood in this space, and therefore the worker then becomes somebody whose job is not clearly defined, whose conditions of work are either not articulated, but even when they are articulated, don't seem to fit into any neat regulatory frameworks because they move across borders and are subject to different legal frameworks. So is there a way to understand and define the role of the worker and her space in ways that go beyond conversations around market efficiencies and gross measures of economic success like growth rate and GDP, and those don't seem to get at what is happening at the bottom of the pyramid. And a lot of organizations, as we found in our research over the past 3 years, have been working on these questions, both multilateral agencies as well as academics and people in the social sector space. And they've tried to sketch out the shape of these gaps and advocate for a system that takes into account the rights and the quality of life and dignity of the person at the bottom of the value chain. And there's a lot you can read about this in the book. But what we'd like to do now in the panel discussion is to throw open some of these questions. And the speakers we have come from very different vantage points. And what we'd like them to do is share some insights from their work and their experience on how we might think through some key questions relating to the issues of the woman worker in a time of global capitalism, digital capitalism. So I'd like to invite the speakers onto the dais. So we first have Dan Green, who is a recent collaborator with FemLab, and he's an assistant professor of information studies from the University of Maryland. And thanks, Dan, for coming here all the way from across the Atlantic. So would you like to take a seat? So the very brief introductions that I'm offering so that we don't take up too much time, I'm hoping will be filled out as each of the speakers talks about what they're doing. So next I'd like to ask Aditi Suri to come up. She's a senior researcher at the Indian Institute of Human Settlements, which has been doing some really interesting work in Bangalore and across India on urban ecosystems and how the worker fits into that space. Next, we have Laura Herman, who is a senior research lead at Adobe and also a doctoral scholar at the Oxford Internet Institute. And finally, Amulya Komaraju, who is an assistant professor at the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad and also a key member of the core FemLab team. So there's a lot more I can say about each of them and their work, but as I said, I'm hoping they will fill it in as they talk about their work in relation to the questions that we have here. So I'd like to start by asking them each to offer initial remarks, addressing some of the questions that we've all been concerned with. What does it mean to have women workers at the bottom of the value chain in these various spaces. Some of them are, of course, covered by digital work and platformized work, but there may be also people who work outside what we strictly consider as platforms, but whose work is nonetheless mediated by digital networks of various kinds. So once each of them speaks for about 7 to 8 minutes, then we'll have a short moderated discussion and then open it up to the audience. So I'd like to start with Dan. So would you like to go ahead?
There we go. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to UVA Press. Thank you to Payal and Usha for leading such a wonderful, wonderful collaboration. And thank you to René for herding all our cats into the same room. So I'm quite taken with this project and with Payal and Usha's approach in general, because I think in this kind of digital labor space, we often have a trend chasing problem where we follow the next app. You know, we're all, probably been asked to write the ChatGPT paper this last month or so. But I think the FemWork framework has been really helpful in asking, what's actually changed? And that's been a major project for me in the last couple of years. So in the introduction to the book, they have this really nice idea of the difference between a workplace, the structure, whether it's architectural, legal, whatever, around where you work, and the work form, who does it, how do they do it, those kinds of things. And in labor studies, and I'm a kind of a labor sociologist at heart, we've been looking at those things for, whenever you want to trace the moment where the train came off the tracks, 1973, whenever. But we've often been quite bad at technology. On the other hand, those of us who work in digital labor have also been quite bad at linking these things to changes in the global political economy that long precede the iPhone or whatever it may be. So I was really happy to be involved here because we share an interest in these fundamental changes that are often obscured by the super European kind of guy-standing precariat discourse. And I credit a lot of my involvement here to Muhi, my collaborators at Maryland, who is just like always insistent and has taught me very much the basic fact that Uber works very differently in New York City versus Mumbai, if for no other reason than the labor markets are different. This story of precarity as destroying the 40-hour work week and the regular paycheck is very different in places where informal labor dominates and where Uber might provide the first paycheck that you've received. So I think one of the really powerful things about this event that people hear is it allows us to break these myths about precarity destroying the same 40-hour work week that everybody has had everywhere, which of course was only ever a privilege for a very small, largely white, largely male section of the global proletariat. One of the myths that I want to talk about here now is about this myth of disintermediation that has accompanied all internet stories for the last 40 years, especially in the 90s, but then again in the late 2000s and early 2010s after the Google IPO. We have this story that the internet ends middlemen. We go directly to the worker, directly to the consumer. No one gets between the thing that you want. There was this great series of MCI, a telco company in the US, commercials in the 1990s of a young Anna Paquin, where she's sitting in the middle of a desert and she says, there's no more distance, there's no more time, there's no more space, we're all just here. And the reality has been exactly the opposite. We have seen an explosion of middlemen. There are more brokers than everywhere. There are more people in between you and your boss, or you and your work, or you and the thing that you want to buy than ever before. What the internet has allowed with global connectivity is to let more and more bosses take a piece. So what we've called this kind of global rise of precarity has also been, I think, like a serious counter-revolution from the 60s and 70s that has resulted in an explosion of bosses. We have more bosses than ever. They're everywhere. So one of the ways I formalize this in my own work with my colleague Ifeoma Junwa, who's at University of North Carolina, is we talk about brokerage in the platform economy. Because it's often very hard to think about what a site like Facebook has in common with a site like Uber, has in common with Mechanical Turk. And I think one way to think about that is that they are middlemen. They're putting themselves as brokers between the worker and their nominal employer. The difference, of course, in work platforms is that you are required to deal with those brokers in order to put food on the table. While many of us are addicted to Twitter or Facebook or whatever, at the end of the day, we usually don't need that to eat. But we must deal with this ocean of brokers in order to work. So that seems like, again, a new wave of bosses that has swept over the whole world. But this is pretty familiar to those of us who've been in the union movement or in the anti-globalization movement for the last 40 years. We just call it something different. We call it usually something like the who's the boss problem. So, Nike, one of the biggest shoe manufacturers in the world, doesn't own any shoe factories. Apple, enormous luxury phone manufacturer, doesn't actually produce any phones. What they do instead are position themselves as managers of intellectual property across an endless chain of suppliers making little parts, little apps, hardware, software, shoelaces, whatever, that gets sorted and arbitraged and pitted against each other so that the bosses can finally take their cut. And in that way, the platform economy is less of a revolution than a kind of movement of the sweatshop model into food delivery, into packages, childcare, wherever we have these apps. Sometimes that is about the introduction of a new boss into your firm. So, in America, if you work at Starbucks, for example, your schedule is going to be automatically set by a software from a firm called Kronos. You don't work for Kronos. You work for Starbucks. Nonetheless, Kronos is what's making you come in for 15 minutes for a shift, 8 hours the next day, nothing for 2 weeks, and then a 16-hour day after that, because that's just what makes sense on the projections that they're making for consumer demand over the next couple of weeks. But these brokers might also be an outsourced function of the firm. So in the 80s and 90s, in this Justice for Janitors campaign that was really big in the US, that was one of our attempts to resuscitate our labor movement, you land into a lot of problems of custodial staff where they do not work for the people who own the building or the people whose offices they're cleaning. In order to pressure their boss for better conditions, you first have to find their boss. And that doesn't mean it's not worth pressuring the people who own the building. It just means that they aren't the people cutting the checks at the end of the day. And the people who are cutting the checks are often insulated from the everyday pressure of the workers. There's some contractor 6 states over. And this is the story. Post-1973, we have this explosion of bosses everywhere. I think it's really worth revisiting in this way. It's a lot of the feminist labor work of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I just reread Iwa Ong's Beautiful Spirits of Resistance, where she talks about Malaysian women in kind of the first wave of industrialized factories hitting Malaysia in the late 70s, having many more bosses than they used to because these women are entering an industrial workforce. So not only do they have the foreman, who is probably Malaysian, the manager, who is probably white, the owner of the factory, who is probably white but is not in Malaysia, is very far away. They have a labor broker in their village, probably of the same ethnicity. They have their dad. They have a boyfriend who was a new social category that was emerging. And all these people are trying to take a cut of that young woman's work when she goes in there. And in that framework, with this explosion of bosses, some of the weird things about the last couple of years start to make sense. You know, labor productivity has been stagnant despite a brief blip in the 90s. We are mostly not making more things faster. So it seems like what's been automated instead is management. We are seeing more and more bosses in more and more places. And it's that where you see all this innovation and all this increase in new technology, not anything that would enable us to do the same thing faster. By way of conclusion, I want to say that, you know, this can look intimidating, and it is, but one of the beautiful things that we get to see in kind of international gatherings like this is that while we are not the same, there is no kind of universal proletarian identity that can bring us all together into the same fight. We often have different angles on the same boss. So in my book about the politics of internet access in the US, I talk about how a place like libraries or schools are prime sites of what we call a community unionism or social justice unionism, where workers must build bonds with students, with parents, in order to take over their workplace. Because what's the first thing the mayor says as soon as the teachers go on strike? Those greedy women in the US, disproportionately black women, are hurting your kids. So if they don't have the kids and their parents on board, they're going to lose. And what I want us to think about in this explosion of bosses is where can we build relationships like that in the platform economy? We've seen some suggested as, for example, like building solidarity between Amazon developers and Amazon logistical workers. There have been some successful campaigns in Facebook to build solidarity between software developers and the people who are drivers, cafeteria workers, security guards, that kind of thing. Those are very place-based relationships. And what I want to think about more while we're all here is how we can extend that further so that we can corner these brokers and cut them off. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hello? Does this work? No? Okay. Yes, now it works. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dan, for that. I think a few ideas that I'd like us to chew on once we have all the speakers present. But can we move on to Aditi, who will, we were chatting a little bit before this, and I think what she has to say will tie very neatly with what Dan has been talking about. Over to you.
So first off, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you to Payal and Usha for doing this for the last 2 years. I am one of those people who has been on Zoom with them for those 2 years, so it's nice to see everyone. And so I am a researcher, I'm a sociologist who's based in India, in South India. And I've been doing this research on platforms since like 2015, when the platform economy really took off in India. So I have had the ability to see it evolve, plateau, break and fall and come back up. And it's been really interesting to see how businesses have had to resurrect themselves and what role labor has had to play in their resurrection or in their demise or how well they've done. And so at the heart of my research, I've been looking at the Indian worker, at the Indian urban worker, and why they choose to work on a platform, right? The Indian economy has a lot of informal jobs where people don't have contracts. They have often variable pay. They might get paid one day, they might not have work the next day. They don't have access to health insurance and benefits from work. And so we have this entire social security system that has nothing to do with employment and work, right? Because the Indian state has never really been able to find the Indian worker through their workplace. So we look at measures of vulnerability and poverty and precarity in all aspects of life rather than just employment. So that was the framing with which I kind of entered the platform to say, having read Guy Standing and all of these things, being like, so Indian workers are already precarious, they already have these issues when it comes to their working conditions. Does the platform do anything to reshape those vulnerabilities? Does it offer them any value? And it's been a really interesting journey looking at how the Indian economy has forced firms to behave in different ways, right? So the couple of things that I have found in my research that I think are quite useful today to talk about is that Indian platforms or platforms in the global south where informality is something that is widespread in the economy, platforms do choose to invest money in employment. So we do have digital platforms in India that offer full employment, that will offer full jobs with 8 hours of work or 10 hours of work, with stable incomes, with health insurance, and payments that are kind of scheduled and done in formal banks, right? And so this is the way in which technology has been used in certain parts of the Indian labor market that has actually used the fact that there's been an informal economy and built on that, right? Rather than just adopting the Uber model. And I think that has been a personal pet peeve of mine, to try and find a way to kind of academically prove that we need to move away from studying the Uber model. I think Uber was really powerful for what it did to the economy. It was really powerful for how it kind of allowed all of these other companies across the world to come up. But we, I think, as all of us, either as consumers or as researchers, kind of gotten stuck in this idea that everything has to be, follows what Uber has done. And I think when I think about how to get better working conditions or better lives for Indian workers and Indian female workers, it seems to me we need to kind of move away from just looking at the Uber model. So in that sense, I have looked at, over the last few years, what does it mean for firms to be able to look at the Indian worker? How do they actually work on creating some kind of value for them? And so one of the really interesting things about the context of the Indian economy, and I think many other places in the global south, is that the platform as a company has actually taken on a pretty significant role other than just existing or providing services for the market, right? So in India, I've started to think about the platform firm not just as a company, but as a governance actor, right? So they are doing all of this extra work that the state should have been doing, or the state could have been doing, but those roles have now been outsourced to the platform firm. And I think this is true for even earlier versions of capitalism. It isn't like the platform has done something to completely change that, but because there is a technology play that platforms can do, I think that the role of the firm has become more formalized. So one of the major things I have found in my own research is that what the digital platform is doing to the Indian worker is financializing them in a way that's never happened before, right? So now that if you have an income coming in from a digital platform, it's traceable, the state knows how much you make, they know how much your household makes, they know where to peg you. And these are things that have been very dicey in the Indian statistical environment. We haven't really been able to tell how many workers do what, how many people make so much money. So in this sense, there's a whole ecosystem of loans and debt that have been created around the platform worker, and how to tap into this bottom of pyramid, right, for the financial sector. And I think that is something that has the true ability to make people even more precarious, right, than they were with just poor working conditions. I think the poor working conditions people have found a way to either deal with or they don't have any other options. But we now see platform workers entering into all forms of loans. We don't know how that data is being generated. We don't know how that data has been shared. But we do know that various, like the Indian state has had a very active and tacit set of partnerships with platform companies. So I think the challenge for workers in the global south, be them women or men, is going to be far beyond the employment classification issue, right? So for me, I don't think giving the Indian Uber driver 8 hours of work and a contract is necessarily going to help them. But keeping them away from predatory loans, keeping them away from how their data is being used, making sure their work has their digital profiles are more interoperable, where they have some ability to control what that data is and how to use it, are challenges that I think we need to start working on in the global south, and I think that will, help our workers go far more than just being able to get the standard employment relationship back, because that's never really existed as a benchmark for us. So I think I'll just pause with these reflections.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aditi, for opening it up further, because I think what academic work tends to do is sometimes to foreclose other ways of imagining a problem space. And I think, thinking about precarity in multiple ways, right, beyond precarity in relation to work, I think is really important. So thanks for that. So I'd like to move on to Laura, who is, as we said, with Adobe and also is an academic researcher.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you to Payal and Usha for inviting me, and to René and Shruti and the whole team for organizing this. I'm very much enjoying it already, looking forward to more conversations. And yes, also to Dan and Aditi for your lovely comments, very insightful. I really want to pick up on something that Dan said, actually, which is this idea that platforms are democratizing and providing direct access between the so-called audience of the platform and the people behind the platform. Something that we've seen in so much research, as you were hinting, is that this democratization is the opposite of what's actually occurring. And instead, these platforms take up the role of the middleman, of the mediator. And I think that's, that feeds into a lot of the work that I've been doing. As Usha mentioned, I'm sort of in this interesting space straddling academia and industry. And my academic research is focused on how algorithmic platforms shape creativity, creative work, and creative expression. And in my more industry research, I'm thinking a lot about how platforms are designed and how that impacts how people use them. So drawing these two sort of parts of my brain together, one thing that's become very obvious is that when platforms are designed and produced, imagined, created by people of the global majority, whether or not they intend for it to be the case, they are designed for the global majority and are inherently sort of excluding members of the precariat. And so this hints at something that a sort of piece of work that I found very influential in my work, which is this idea of data colonialism, Nick Coldry's work, thinking about how it's not only the platforms that create these structures of work or expression, but also how they use these platforms to then collect data, which they then sell, therefore sort of monetizing these vulnerable audiences. And in the context of algorithmic platforms, which I would say most of these platforms are becoming increasingly algorithmic. So for example, Meta has announced that Instagram will double the amount of algorithmically curated content in news feeds in 2023, this year. As these platforms become increasingly algorithmic, there is this sort of enormous scale and just sort of exacerbation of some of these problems that we've already been seeing as it relates to data. And so I think these problems and these questions are more urgent than ever. And because I'm focused more on the creative side of things, I just want to mention that briefly, because I think creative work is a really unique space that has always been very precarious, but is now becoming even more precarious in some ways due to the mediation of these algorithmic platforms. And And even if you're not thinking about creative work, but you're just thinking about creative expression, that is necessary for cultures around the world. And when you have these algorithmic platforms being trained on only certain types of creativity that fit into certain cultural molds, that's inherently sort of excluding other forms of creativity and creative expression, which I find to be extremely concerning and problematic. So one example which we give in the book is this idea of this sort of handmade and mass-produced dichotomy, which Payal brought up a couple of years ago now, I guess, in that podcast. And we were talking about how in this sort of Western conception of the handmade object, that it cannot be mass-produced. Whereas, and there's a sort of inherent dichotomy of like, it is either mass-produced or it is handmade. But in many situations with, the example of sort of artisan communities in India, things are being mass-produced and they're being handmade. But on a Western-born platform like Etsy, for instance, it perceives handmade objects as not mass-produced. Mass-produced objects as not handmade. And Etsy only wants to sell handmade objects, so it deplatforms anything that it deems mass-produced, which is actually then shutting a lot of workers in the Global South out of their platform because their sort of creative norms and their creative ways of being, making, doing, do not match these sort of Western cultural ideals. So that's just a little sort of example, and I think there's so many others, of course, where there's a mismatch between the way that an algorithmic platform perceives what is normal, what is acceptable, and the reality on the ground. And I think that's sort of tying together a lot of what we're speaking about today. So I'll just conclude by saying that as someone coming from a bit more of the sort of design space or the applied research space, I think it's one solution, not the only solution, but one solution, hopefully, is to really make sure that the people developing these platforms understand the local sort of cultural norms and communities, develop relationships with those communities, and in many cases, hopefully, co-create, co-design with those communities. It would also be, wonderful to see new platforms springing out from the Global South, which I think speaks to Payal's idea that the next ideas are not going to come from the West. I'm really excited to see what those next big ideas are.
Thank you, Laura. In fact, time for applause, of course. But what I forgot to mention earlier is that the book sort of is organized around three major principles, which are design, governance, and networks. And we have a fourth section, which is about reimagining the future of work. And in some ways, we've covered all those three areas in the first three talks, where we need to look at platforms as entities on a macro level. We also need to look at the ecosystem that is generated by platforms. And then we come back to the internal workings of platforms and how they tend to destabilize our ideas of the democratization promise that platforms had been sort of been imagined as giving us. So I'd like to move on now to Amulya, who in FemLab, she led one of the sectors which looked at home-based salon workers. And through her work, she's come up with insights that were sometimes really surprising. So Amulya, over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Raman. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and attending the book launch and the panel discussion. Also, thanks to my co-panelists, some brilliant insights there. I'll try to build on what they've said, the operative word being try. As someone who's been informed by feminist theory, methodologically and theoretically, I'll begin with what can be a little abstract, which is the ethic of care and empathy in design. But I'll try to ground it with examples so that I sort of also address the praxis part of what I'm going to speak about. So most scholarship on platform economy begins with the status of the platform workers. Platform workers as being neither entirely self-employed nor employees. Platform workers are neither completely independent nor completely subordinate. Platform companies are neither intermediaries, market intermediaries, nor employers. Digitization, as we all know, replaces this traditional worker relationship, the standard employment contract, to establish worker, platform, customer sort of a relationship, a triangular relationship where work is perceived by platforms simply as supply and demand. That is all. The business model of these companies is such that it's devoid of any sort of a social form of labor or employment relationship. So what rights are we going to talk about when there is a struggle to define and frame laws around it? When platforms operate in a gray zone, especially in Global South contexts. And why Global South? I'll get into that in just a bit. Fairness is a function of both, say, social and political factors. So location and context become very important, therefore the Global South. These are important considerations when one thinks about fairness in platform economy and what it looks like. So labor in Global South has largely been extractive in nature, and this is courtesy to the legacy of the colonial rule. So where imperialists followed policy of expansion, there is still a modicum of labor empowerment. But where the imperialists followed a policy of extraction, there have been a lot of laws, but the implementation is lacking. So there are plenty of labor laws, yes, but these are limited to large enterprises, which is why ethical dumping is easier. So where experiments in West that cannot be conducted, they can be conducted in Global South context. Where there's a lot of tedious, repetitive tasks that cannot be conducted in the West, they tend to be dumped to the Global South context, right? So this is why, at the risk of repeating myself, I say that location and context are important, particularly when it comes to women workers, since it's easier to think of women as mothers and sisters, but not as workers. The dominant understanding of what work is, who a worker is, what work timings are, they're informed by a logic of masculinity. So while care work can still be thought of as women's work, those women who choose to become drivers on, say, Uber, how do you think of them? They're not even acknowledged as drivers. So intersectional dynamics, insofar as it includes caste, of platform work needs focus to come close to acknowledging and understanding women workers' lives in its totality. Since an ethic of care is prerequisite to ensure worker-centered design and to avoid the pitfalls of care washing, there needs to be a way in which a care test can be conducted, right? So how would this work? We need to take a more granular approach then to think about it. For instance, if we think about nudging, to borrow from behavioral economists, is the way in which business capitalize on people's emotions and desires and decision processes. So because desires and affect are, of course, context sensitive, it would mean thinking about how AI could begin to influence how people view themselves and the society as well. So AI supervision is mostly invisible, and service partners on platforms, for most part, don't have to report to a human boss. So there is a positive effect there, right? When there's a missing boss, there's a positive effect because they seem to think that they're working for themselves. But they're also aware that customers are rating and reviewing them, and these processes are not very transparent to them. So there's an effort on part of the platform, a deliberate attempt on part of the platform to establish a false sense of ownership and autonomy to encourage an internal locus of control on part of the workers. And because of this technique, service partners that we've spoken with as part of FemLab work, they seem to blame themselves for whatever goes wrong with their work, especially in reference to their rating and reviews that the customers give. And this, I think, also adds another layer to the entrenched culture of servitude that is a characteristic of traditional societies. So values and ethics of platform design would have to take into account both direct harms and indirect harms. For instance, what does it mean when platforms don't penalize workers who don't take up late work or late evening or night slots, but incentivize them? What does it mean for the woman worker who has to make this choice? But women workers also tell me that there's a learning curve on the job. So when they do get a late night slot, it is only after working with the platform for a bit that they understand it's the trade-off is not really right, that they don't have to take these late evening or night slots. Again, context is important because Some parts of India are perceived to be safer, some parts perceived to be high risk. And in these high risk areas, usually service platform workers are accompanied by their husbands, and they are thought to be a safety net, an added layer of safety net, right? But which means that it is not up to them whether they accept a particular gig or not. It is also a joint decision that the husband is involved in. So how does one make space and design for dignity is very complex. Now, platforms are not in the business of demand and supply. They don't exist in vacuum. They don't operate in vacuum. So one has to think about market, law, architecture, and norms. So these are the interdependent forces of regulation, right? In terms of market, one needs to move from logic of extraction to empowerment, which requires for the law to move from protection, which is patriarchal and paternalistic, to finally talk about solidarity, and in architecture, or what we refer to as design, from manipulation and obfuscation to transparency regarding the terms and conditions of the work contract, and this is just the surface of it. Norms, because we all know and research shows that social norms-based change is long-lasting. But why should we think about these interdependent forces of regulation? Because designing for dignity would mean three things: dignity at work, dignity in work, and dignity from work. And for this to be achieved, the four interdependent forces of regulation need to be thought of as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Amulya. So that sort of rounds off this discussion. But I'd like to get into a couple of small, well, not small, but a couple of points that all of you made before throwing it open to the audience. I think we have about 15 minutes after this internal discussion for you all to raise questions. So in some ways, we've moved, like I said before, from the macro to the very micro. And even though you did talk about it in terms of abstraction, Amulya, it is, I mean, you ended with very concrete details, right? Which also sort of, I think, align with the sort of detail that Laura was talking about in terms of distinctions between what people do and how it is represented on the platform, and how the algorithm then controls how it is represented. And I wanted to link that back to the very first talk, from Dan, where you talked about the multiplicity of bosses. So what do you do when this explosion of bosses involves not just people, but non-human actors like algorithms? So, I mean, any of you could talk about that, but would you like to address that?
So I think one of the advantages of being an old-fashioned Marxist is that you just don't care about the distinction between abstract and concrete. You just, keep pushing them against each other until the contradiction works itself out. And I think in that way, while I, often don't use the kind of, actor network ideas in my politics and like my normative view of what the good life is, I think there is a lot of value in finding these new bosses and tracing them out into the world so that we are able to see how these conflicts affect other spaces of people's lives outside of work, so that we are able to see people with the same issues who are not at the same workplace, and find surprising alliances that you might not have otherwise. So to return to the example of like Starbucks in the US and the really abusive scheduling there, in the UK, I think you guys call it like 0-hour contracts, but in America, every contract is a 0 hours contract. And, one of the things that really shows is this really serious lack of childcare in the US. When you, have these like 45-minute increments that have been algorithmically predicted to be necessary at work, and you have to have a 90-minute commute to get there, and you have no idea whether that's going to be the case next week. It's really impossible to plan for childcare. That then becomes an issue to organize around with people who may not be at the same Starbucks, but share a deep, deep anger at this unpredictable scheduling. That's something to bring people together around in your apartment building, in your neighborhood, anything like that, where people may be able to provide support to each other to solve this problem that they have in common, because they all share this same algorithmic boss, even if it's not their personal boss. And that's a bond of solidarity, where these people are not identical, they don't have the same experience. I have a childcare problem, so does the custodial staff in my office. We are not the same. But we share the same interest in solving that problem and providing a public good that would render that person unnecessary, or that boss unnecessary. So that's how I like to think about it, kind of like tracing those bosses out into the world where we might, come together against them.
So I think, that also brings me to what Aditi was talking about in terms of if place is so important, and one of the ways in which solidarities could be formed is around place, and whether that place is a place that we all share in terms of work or something else. How does one then bring that sort of an idea related to place in relation to algorithmic bosses to the sort of concerns you were raising, which is outside the work ecosystem, but in some ways, again, these solidarities in relation to the sort of vulnerabilities you were talking about have to do, our commonalities across sectors even. So could we envision a solidarity emerging from that sort of commonality?
I think definitely, because vulnerability is shaped so much by where you live, what you have access to, who you vote for, who helps you get access to those things. And so there's definitely chances and opportunities there that we can exploit. And I think one of the examples I'll lead this with is what is happening in a North Indian state right now called Rajasthan. So Rajasthan is a fairly small state. It's a desert state. It doesn't have as many people as maybe other parts of the country. But what they have done, which is probably one of the first places in the world to have done this, is they have legally created a social security fund for gig workers now. Right? So there is a pot of money that the government of Rajasthan has put aside for welfare benefits, for accident insurance, for unemployment insurance, etc., for gig workers, which is a fairly exceptional thing to do, right? What they have done then is absorb the platform of any responsibility they had, but have hopefully will at least ask for a certain amount of money to fund this, to add to this fund. But they have said, we acknowledge that platform workers are precarious. We acknowledge that these people exist in our state. They are our citizens. They are our voters, more importantly. And so we have to find a way of supporting them, right? And this is a downstream kind of effect of a larger central government law that does the same. And the story of how this law has come into effect tickles me, because it's just so surreptitious and opportunistic. We had an Indian political leader who was walking through the country trying to build support for one of the political parties, and he met with a significant workforce of gig workers in Rajasthan, and through that they were able to, through the very spatial identity of being from Rajasthan, from being of particular caste communities and from being male workers, were able to kind of elicit his support. And then he, of course, was able to kind of force the state government then to kind of build a law around this, right? And I'm so taken by this example at how quickly these things can move sometimes, and how many decades you can spend trying to make unions stronger and make collective bargaining stronger, and then this happens, and then you're like, great, that's amazing. But what it did show, and I've been part of several of these conversations with the Rajasthan state government, with the unions there, is that in this moment of capturing this moment, they have left aside the female worker, they have left aside any kind of female worker that works from home, female worker that works on platforms in the city. So it is both exceptional for many reasons. So, I mean, the space-based identity has come with its own politics. Collective bargaining also then comes with its own politics. And in India, it has been just a replication of this, of kind of leaving women out of these. So I think there are many battles to be fought, and all of them have to be fought continuously. So I'm still very happy that this has happened in the state of Rajasthan. I do appreciate the Indian government's move to kind of rearrange the working relationship so that workers do eventually get some social security. So I do think we're going in the right way, but there are many, many battles to be won.
Yeah, it always seems that, when, a gender affirmative or a gender sensitive imagination has to be added on. Yes, I mean, that's one of the things that the Bharat Jodo Yatra delivered. And I'm wondering if, Amulya and Laura, if you could speak to this, because in some ways, Amulya, you were talking about something that's very much space-based. Context, as you said, is really important. And how does context then context is never one thing, right? Even if you're talking about one city or one state, it's never one thing. So how does one imagine, again, for simplicity, I'm using the word solidarity, but how does one imagine a solidarity that is trans-contextual? Yeah.
I think I'll go back to what Dan said in terms of politics of affinity. It doesn't matter which sector you belong to or which state you belong to. As long as you know that there's, for instance, again to borrow from Dan, you know that there's an algorithmic boss. It doesn't matter whether you're from Uber or you're from Urban Company. You know that you're fighting a similar battle. So I think even as a feminist, I would think politics of affinity, because the moment you categorize yourself as a geek, I mean, I understand where Aditi is coming from, that it's, and of course, all battles need to be won. And yes, at the same time, because this add and mix has been happening for a long time. So you have one law in place, and then you think, oh, women, let's add women to this particular thing. Oh, marginal community of that particular specific group, let's add that to the law as well. In terms of thinking of solidarity beyond identity politics, what we've found from the work that we've done for FemLab is that women from across sectors sort of come together, or even if they're in one particular work, they come together. It doesn't matter whether they've trained together for beauty work or if they've trained together to work for a platform. As long as there's this one bit of connection, you're a friend of a friend and you're in the same network, then you're friends and you're exchanging information. And I think this sort of solidarity, if you keep thinking about trade unionization as the most dominant way of collectivizing, then you completely skip about this aspect that there's something to be said about politics of affinity and speaking to each other just as humans and then perhaps as workers. So again, we sort of go back, and that's something that we do in the book as well, that thinking of women workers as human beings first and foremost, and then work is a part of it. And I think that's also important in the capitalist societies that we're living in, because somehow companies tend to make you believe that work is your life. Work is what gives you meaning. But that's not true. You have to go beyond that. But to actually answer that question, I think politics of affinity and trying to think of collectivization is beyond trade unionization to actually understanding how women workers especially are collectivizing. Because trade union work, usually trade unionists are male, right? Men who sort of work. And we've had this history in India where women in the left movement learned it the hard way that this battle is a separate battle, gender-based battle is a separate battle. But yeah, thank you. Laura, do you want to?
Yeah, I can speak actually to the first question that you asked around the multiplicity of bosses. I think it's really interesting to think about these algorithmic bosses. I really like that phrase, actually, because there's suddenly this shift in work where you are no longer trying to appease a human boss who, of course, is loaded with their own biases, and there's been many problems with many human bosses before. I'm not minimizing that. But there's a special kind of precarity that comes with the algorithmic boss. So thinking about, again, creators, because that's sort of what a lot of my research has been on, there is an immense fear in sort of the creative spaces that the algorithmic boss, if we're calling it that, could suddenly change its mind overnight. And I'm using purposefully anthropomorphizing language. But could suddenly change its mind overnight, and their content, what they're making, is no longer visible, right? They're completely deplatformed, and when their entire, again, livelihood is formulated on the context of that platform, and underneath this sort of algorithmic boss, that's extremely, extremely precarious. It's sort of the ultimate precarity. And so I think it's really interesting to think about this over-metricization, I guess, that algorithmic bosses lead to. Another example, which actually I think Payal has written about as well in the past, is this idea of like an art curator. And you think of that as a sort of ultimate elitist figure, trained in these very elite institutions, making decisions, sort of decreeing what is culturally viable, what is valuable, what is sort of making up the fabric of our society. And now you see algorithms, in many cases, determining what we see, how we see it, whose work gets seen. And it actually is not to say one is better or worse, because those algorithmic curators are making decisions that are inherently based on metrics and quantifiable metrics, which in many cases of creative work can't be quantified. So in some ways, there's, again, this idea of like, oh, it's democratizing. Suddenly the people can say what they want to see. There's this direct relationship between the creator and the audience, but in fact, no, the curator has just been replaced by an algorithmic boss. And so I think reframing how the public is thinking about this will actually be really important, because I think many people don't realize what a large role these algorithmic bosses are having, not only over the workers, but over the sort of consumers of that work as well. So I think it's maybe not an algorithmic boss, but some sort of algorithmic determiner of their experience. So.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that. And, I have many more questions, but hopefully we will have time to talk about them offline. But I'd like to now open it up to the audience. And if there are questions, we have about 7 minutes.
Yes. Hey, thank you, everyone. I'm René. I'm the third editor of the book. Again, thanks really for a very nice opening of this topic and a great discussion. I don't want to waste too much of your time with concluding words. Maybe it just allow me that much. So I'm kind of found myself in the marginal position of being a white man in this project, which was a very interesting experience. And a really nice experience. And I think we kind of had, if I remember correctly, we had on our website like the promise that we are not only going to look at the global south, but we are also connecting this. We're going to also address questions that are interesting for us globally, right? So I would like to also connect it more to that, if you know what I mean, the inherent danger, I think you addressed it partly already, is that we might get lost in contexts, right? As important as it is that, as you made very clear, that we, are sensitive to this context. Is it going to be like a dead idea, this old idea of universalist approaches and so on? That's just a question I have. You don't need to answer it, but if no one else has a question, you may. But just some food for thought. But we already have a question here, please.
Hi. Thank you, everyone. I'm Deborah Allen Rogers, Find Out Why Digital Fluency Lab in The Hague, peace builder. But I was a clothing designer in New York City in the 80s and 90s. So and I'm age 61, so just to give a little bit of context in terms of what I'm going to say next. I think what's interesting about your research, all of you refrain from saying paid worker. And what I would like, as an old garmento and somebody that was, in factories in India and in China and so on back in the day, at the beginning of this sort of change in textiles and clothing being made all in the Far East, I guess, and in the South. So paid worker, I wondered if any of you could talk about paid and unpaid workers, or at least put that in your research a little bit more fiercely, because unpaid, well-paid, paid but not receiving a paycheck, etc. One other thing I want to add is I made a feminist choice to become an unpaid caregiver when I decided to quit being a garmento and raise my two sons, who are now grown. And I'm going to deal with that for the rest of my life, for the 20 years that I received zero paycheck. However, I've been able to retain the value. That's a whole other story. But, okay, so I'm going to hand the mic back, but I just really would love to have you guys talk about the distinction between paid and unpaid, low paid all the way to well paid, and then the three-legged table of the worker, the wage, and the receipt of payment. Because that's where freedom for women is going to lie. The receipt of payment and the control of my own money. I just wonder what you think about that.
Would anyone like to respond to that? I mean, just very briefly, we do acknowledge in some parts of the book that there is a huge segment of, it tends to be largely women who are engaged in productive labor that is unpaid. So the kind of care work you're talking about, for instance, right, that definitely has value, but it's not seen as productive labor in the market. So, I mean, there is an acknowledgement, but this is certainly an area we would like to look at more, but maybe one of the others.
I think just as a very quick response, because we're out of time, but I think it's a very curious question to think of from India. Like you're saying, with the context of women have not had the power to have their own money or to use their own money. And I think I mean, I hate saying this, but some of the more government approaches to this have been that we finally have people with their own bank accounts who actually have control over their money, or at least they're receiving the money. How that gets used in the household, of course, is up to the household. But that is one of the promises that so far we haven't found evidence against in the platform economy in India, right? So now the magnitude of unpaid work that goes into actually making these jobs work, it varies across sectors, and Amelia gave an example of husbands having to accompany their women to jobs. But I do think the one thing that the platform has done is individualize the worker in a very particular light. So there are instances where you take yourself out of your caste community, out of your family household community, to do that work. Of course, you slip back into it very quickly, but some of those promises do exist. So just as a quick response.
I really appreciate this comment, in part because what brings me here is the Wages for Housework campaign from the 70s, and that was designed in part as an impossible demand to say that if women in particular were paid for the free work that was provided, that would destroy everything. The system would be able to cease running. But I think with some of the stuff that Aditi has said, and thinking especially about these microfinance platforms that have popped up everywhere, it seems like capital has been able to absorb that demand, and it wasn't impossible at all. So what we have instead is this explosion of debt across the global south for people being paid for what was previously home work, previously a cash-only economy, something like that. So I would say that in part, one of the things that this feminist approach gives us is to be able to track the movement between paid and unpaid work that most people, especially women, go through throughout their lives, throughout their day, throughout their career. The older way of looking for things where the waged worker is the classical figure of capitalism. When you look beyond Manchester in the 1860s or whatever. That's not the case. What's more normal, even if you just stay in the US and go to California or something, is people moving between various wage forms that might be paid one day, might not, might look like slavery until it gets formalized with a paycheck, but it's the exact same work. These things have happened over and over again across the world. And if we are focused only on the work that you're receiving a wage for, we're very much missing the effect of these platforms, these bosses that are inserting themselves everywhere.
To add to that about receipt of work, right, of the wage that you've been paid, that's a double-edged sword in Indian context at least, because what platforms have done is to standardize the kind of earnings that you get. For instance, in platformized beauty care, you know how much you're going to receive in payment for, say, a haircut or for shaping your eyebrows. The problem with that is the partner involved. So the woman worker's husband knows exactly how much is going to be paid. This is something that doesn't happen in non-platformized work, because then the woman can demand whatever she wants for her services with, of course, there are limitations to that as well. This is something that we see in domestic work as well, where domestic help are able to demand certain kind of wage for a month, but when they go back home, they don't report the entire amount. They tell them that it's, say, 80% of the wage that they're getting, and then the 20% goes to basically savings, which is, again, homework economics, it's called, which is also problematic, but yeah, about the receipt, it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, we have another question here. After that, I'm afraid we already need to wrap it up, and we're going to have some drinks and snacks afterwards. So probably also a chance to get in touch with our panelists and ask some more questions directly to them. Please, your question first.
Thank you. My name is Shiloh Phillips. Thank you so much for your talk so far. And my question is a classic one, which is about education and how can you expect of people in this, let's say, lower tiers of a pyramid in extremely precarious situations to understand what's going on, let alone to imagine solidarity or come into action or find other people. I mean, these platforms are designed not to be able to come in contact with other people in similar positions. And although there's a lot of people that could benefit from finding each other and mobilizing, ain't got the time for so many reasons. So I'm curious, specifically, if it comes to imagining solidarity, what have you found so far when it comes to the tools to be able to imagine or to come into action in these positions so far?
Great question. Thank you so much. But there's evidence from India, from the work that we've done, from China, that apps like Telegram and WhatsApp are great places for these seemingly isolated workers to come together. And another thing that I'm sure hasn't skipped the platform is they have training sessions for workers. So it's during these training sessions that they work together in pairs and they become friends, and then they're part of these groups. And on these groups, they're discussing platform policies. They're also discussing or forwarding memes and jokes. So for us, what we think of solidarity is not just veered towards work, but also the kind of solidarity that exists on account of being in that particular space, from that particular caste location or a class location or a gender location. So we've seen evidence from both China and other contexts that it's possible. And one of the reasons why we conducted this research was also to sort of see how are digital technologies helping workers organize themselves, and there's evidence for it. But thank you for the question.
I'll just say very briefly, I think it's extremely interesting to see this sort of organization of people via other algorithmic platforms to discuss the other algorithmic platforms. Yeah. So they're trying to sort of hack the other platforms to create a space or a niche where they can then exist and form solidarity to then make changes in how they act in the other contexts, which I've just found really interesting. Sophie Bishop has this concept of algorithmic lore that I find really beautiful to think about how people use these other platforms to try to figure out how they might gain visibility in the context of other platforms. And that's not necessarily, I guess, solidarity in the same sense that Amelia is talking about. And I think in her chapters, there's this beautiful description of some of like the lived physical contextual experiences that will not be the same in these other algorithmic platforms, but especially in a sort of isolated COVID context, and in the situation in which these workers might be in very discrete locations and might have no situation in which they would overlap with each other, it is really interesting to see the sort of reconfiguration of the algorithmic platform actually as a sort of beneficial place to find some of that solidarity. Of course, that makes it even more precarious because then it can be, ripped out from underneath them so easily, as we were talking about before. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I would say, respectfully, I think the concern is correct but misplaced because workers are always organizing, always teaching themselves, always learning, if for no other reason than they have to survive. They have to figure out what to do. There's, to be a cranky Marxist again, there's this old letter with the Hilder thing where he says, along those lines of like, our job is not to tell people who are struggling, this is what you should be struggling for. This is what's really happening. Our job is to say, this is what you're struggling for. We see you, we're telling the story of what is going on, we're helping you connect to other people, we're helping you tell the story of the world as it really is instead of correcting your vision of the world. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about this book is that it's connecting all these different struggles in very different places and taking seriously people's story of their own explanation of what's going on. An example in like my backyard in DC is that Uber drivers don't have a hiring hall. They don't have somewhere where they're all hanging out, except for the destination. So everyone learned when they went to the airport that they could juice their wages by all getting together at the same time and all deactivating the app simultaneously, thereby reducing supply and increasing the demand for their stuff, and they would take turns turning it back on in order to get benefit from the increased wages. So people are always, always creatively learning about what to do. Our job is not to correct them, but to learn from them and help them connect to each other.
Yeah, so I think with that we'll have to end. And René, any last words?
Well, no, just thank you again to everyone, including the audience, also online. And yeah, just a quick note, maybe to the people who are attending our workshop. Let's meet around 6:50 here, so keep an eye on that you don't miss us. And yeah, again, let's have a bit of a more of a conversation over drinks and snacks. Thank you so much, everyone.